Welcome to Smart Talk, a series of new and challenging interviews with world-leading economists. In this episode, I have the pleasure of interviewing Professor Paul Davidson. Professor Davidson is a Post Keynesian economist, well known for his writings and discussions on economic policies that have been influenced by imperfect understanding of Keynes's general theory. Professor Davidson is Professor Emeritus at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, as well as a visiting scholar at the New School, and he has taught at the University of Bristol and the University of Cambridge, as well as Rutgers University. We consider Professor Davidson to be the economist who has had the most correct understanding of Keynes' general theory. Professor Davidson's new book, Post Keynesian Theory and Policy, concisely sums up the theoretical errors made in influencing and interpreting Keynes' theory. He sets the record straight. I'm Andrew Mazzoni, president of the Henry George School of Social Science, and this is Smart Talk. Professor Davidson, thanks for being with us. So let me introduce Professor Davidson. He's the Professor of Excellence Emeritus at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. He's a visiting scholar at the New School, and he's taught it at the University of Bristol, University of Cambridge, and taught at Rutgers. Let me just say that we've chosen to interview him because, in our opinion, he's been the economist who's been mostly right for the longest period of time in America. Now, he's a post-Keynesian, and of course, that's kind of an odd school, a different school. It's a heterodox school. It's not the classical school. So I'm going to introduce him by the two questions that he posed in his book, which was Post Keynesian Theory and Policy. Paul talks about the Queen of England that in 2008 mystified as to what went on. How could this happen? How could this world come apart when there's so many smart people watching the store, so many mainstream economists studying the problems? So the Queen poses a rhetorical question, and also after the crash, the doyen of conservative economists, Federal Reserve guy, Greenspan goes in front of Congress, mea culpa, I find a flaw in my model. Of course, he didn't specify the model. It was understood it was a mainstream model, and of course, everyone shook their head. Oh, okay, you found a flaw. But in the meantime, after the deluge, we see that a small percentage of the population ends up owning all the wealth after all this monstrous error. But no one's saying anything about that. They're complaining a little now, but they get away with it in effect. So, Paul, I throw it to you. How could you smart guys have missed all this?
Well, my answer in the book was very simple, that the theory that almost all economists who taught politicians and businessmen and others, media people, it was a theory which was a theory about a fairy tale economy, which I call a classical economy. But basically, it was how an economy is very efficient, works fine, and so on and dandy. And if you don't mess around with it, you get the results. And when this thing happened, this crash, nobody could understand it because nobody was fooling around. No government official was fooling around. There was some regulation, but not much regulation. And the thing crashed. And everybody thought they were doing right, but they were doing wrong if they would have had a theory about the real world rather than this fairy tale theory. So the question is, what's the difference about the real world from the fairy tale world? And that's where I point out, or I argue, that Keynes was an academic, but also was a big wheeler and dealer in financial markets and in government, understood how the real world operated. One thing, for example, that I tell mainstream economists, and which is shocking to me, is in the real world, every market transaction that we have is organized via a money contract. That is, even if it's verbal, shaking hands is a contract, which is a legal document, basically. And if one party or the other doesn't agree, it doesn't live up to it, what it agreed to, the government can come in and enforce, and the payment is always, the obligation is always, will be fixed by paying out money. The example I often use to when I was teaching in the students was, suppose I suddenly got a phone, here I am at Tennessee, and I get a phone call from the dean at Harvard, and he says, our macroeconomist has suddenly died. We need somebody to come and teach. Can you teach? Come and teach right away, and we'll give you this X thousands of dollars. And of course, teaching at Harvard is much more prestigious than teaching at Tennessee. So I said, of course. And I march into the dean's office and I say, I'm sorry, but I'm leaving because I got this great offer. And the dean says, you can't leave. We have a contract. And I say, I don't care. Slavery is illegal. You can't make me teach here because then I'd be a slave. So I'm leaving. Okay, leave, but he can sue me. And what can he, and my obligation is not to go back and teach, because that would be slavery. But my obligation would be, the court would say, I have caused a certain amount of damage and the dean has to hire somebody else and it's certain cost. So I have to pay him a certain sum of money, which the court decides, pays him for all the costs and gets him back to where he wants to be. So money discharges every obligation. And so money becomes the essence of understanding how economy operates. Well, if you're just a layman, you understand that very well because you're dealing with money all the time.
Well, the classical economists say that money is neutral, that essentially over time it cancels itself out, and things that are affected by money aren't affected at all long term. They just deny that principle.
Well, that's it. In the mainstream economics, contracts are real. It's equivalent of a barter economy. You want a chicken, I'll give you a goat. I'll give you a chicken if you give me milk from a goat or something like that. We barter things, but barter is very rarely done. It's done occasionally, but very rarely. And a barter contract is usually not enforceable in the law anyhow. So you've got to understand how a monetary economy operates. And that's why I've been more successful, because I think, following Keynes, I understand how a monetary economy operates, whereas most of my professional colleagues, Nobel Prize winners or otherwise, don't really understand. They think money is just a veil, and you have to get behind money to see what is really happening.
Minsky, Hyman Minsky, would you consider him a classic economist, even though he had a theory of boom and bust based on, overdoing investment enthusiasm, that it was built into the system, but not necessarily implying that money was not neutral?
Hi and I were good friends, and for a number of years we had a summer school in Trieste, Italy, where we both would teach. And Hi sort of was, what should I say, a hybrid. Hi was a hybrid. He was half classical and half money. He saw that something in the financial system, particularly financial markets, tended to create problems. But he really didn't buy into Keynes's theory of liquidity completely. So but when the market collapses, as it did, people talk about this as a Minsky moment, because that's Hyde kept saying that somehow or other financial markets collapse. Well, when Hy and I used to talk, I used to say and this was before 2008, this was in the late 1990s, the last time you had a Minsky moment was in 1929, and he was still living the Great Depression and understanding. He understood how the Great Depression operated, or what happened when the Great Depression occurred because of the financial collapse. And he was continually saying this was going to happen. So in 2007 or 8, he was probably right, but that's 70 years or 80 years difference. In 80 years, the economy did a lot of things which I really couldn't explain or didn't care to explain. He he kept saying, we're going to fall off the bridge soon.
Let me just make an aside, although it's not the mainstream of my discussion with you. You have a reference in your book about George Soros's reflexive view of the monetary system. Now that's starting to creep into discussions. If you could explain your view of the reflexive element of Soros's theory juxtaposed to the liquidity preference theory, I think it would be a very interesting explanation for many people.
I know George Soros, and in fact, I'm on an advisory board for George Soros has set up a Institute for New Economic Thinking, and I'm on the advisory board of that. And it's because there is a confluence between what George is thinking about. We overlap a little bit. And basically, the part where we overlap is where George says basically economy is reflexive, meaning that what people do and react to each other affects the future. Okay. And that is basically what same thing that Keynes and Post Keynesian argument was that the future is created by decisions that people make today in the money market, in the financial markets, and even sometimes in real investment and things like that. So George's theory is right in the sense of behavior. Today's behavior creates tomorrow's problems or successes. And that's reflexively. And basically the problem then is, how do you predict it? And I should point out, maybe I should, well, let's leave it at that. I'll talk about George more if you ask questions.
Well, okay, well, let's go to the liquidity preference theory, which essentially says that money can hide out in non-reproducible assets. Now, this seems to be a huge difference here between the classics and the post-Keynesians and Keynes. And I think this is a crucial difference. I think you had the argument with Samuelson at the 100th birthday celebration of Keynes, where you challenged him, saying, well, how do you come up with, the fact that non-reproducibles are not something that will nullify, let's say, Say's law? I think it's a crucial concept, and I'd like you to explain to the audience just how crucial that is and how important it is that differentiates your school from the mainstream.
Very simple. First of all, remember this idea that everything in the market requires a money contract. Liquidity means you have money to meet all your contractual obligations. What happens if you can't meet a contractual obligation? You got a big problem. Okay, so you can have either a bank deposit, which is money, and you can write checks. But when you save, when you take your current income and you spend some of it on buying goods and services, you are creating income for the people who are selling products to you. The portion of your current income that you don't spend, you save. And the question is, what form do you leave this savings in? Well, you could hold it as money and put it, if you're a miser, put it in the mattress or something like that. But most people take this sum of money that they have and they buy some financial asset. That is, they buy a stock, a bond, a mutual fund, money market account, and so on and so forth. Well, what is that money asset? That's that financial asset. They buy it because they think it's liquid. That is, if I have stock in General Motors, I cannot go into the grocery store and buy something and give them one share of General Motors to pay and ask for a change. I have to go and get money. So if I need money to buy something in the grocery store, I know I can resell General Motors stock and get a price, and the price is going to be very close to the last price on the ticker. So a liquid asset is a financial asset which is non-producible. That is, it's not something that you produce by hiring workers. If the demand for financial assets go up, you don't hire workers to produce more financial assets. Okay. And so the idea is I can sell this asset in a resale market for a price. It becomes liquid. That is, it can become converted into money very easily at very low cost, brokerage fee or something like that. And then I can discharge this contract at the supermarket. Now, the Keynes said that liquid assets, including money, had two essential properties, and these essential properties is what causes some financial problems. One is that they are non-reproducible. That is, unlike peanuts, for example, if the demand for peanuts goes up, what will happen? Entrepreneurs will hire. I used to love that example when Jimmy Carter was president, because he was a former peanut farmer. His son and his brother Billy was still, and I'd say Jimmy Carter should have made Billy head of the Federal Reserve, because if the demand for money goes up and the money is peanuts, Billy will hire more workers and pluck more peanuts off the bushes, and that's how you create peanuts. So when the demand for liquidity, for money goes up, if it's producible, that creates a demand for jobs, a demand for workers. So if we get back to the idea of a consumer, when he buys things, he's creating jobs for workers. If he saves, if he saves in the form of non-producible, that is not creating jobs. That part of his income is, in essence, denying somebody a job. If he spends his income, it's creating
the argument
a job.
might be the argument might be for the Samuelson would say, if you bought a stock, isn't it true that the cash that you pay could be used for real fixed investment, and therefore there's a non-reproducible that in effect turns into a reproducible, continuing the link. Your comment on that?
Well, let me put it a slightly different way than you put it. If I save, that's preventing somebody from earning income. In order to make sure that person who I'm not giving income to gets income, somebody else in the economy has to dissave, has to spend more than his income to create this job for this person that I am. So normally we think of investors don't usually use their savings to buy new durable manufactured plant and equipment and so on and so forth. They instead go out and borrow it or sell equities or something like that. So this saving equaling to my saving, that still creates income. But if they stop this saving, if they stop spending more than they're earning, and I don't spend everything, then people's incomes shrink and incomes go down. And that was what Keynes's theory was all about. In an entrepreneurial economy, spending money on producible goods is creating income. A penny saved is a penny not earned by somebody. It would be Keynes's motto, as opposed to Benjamin Franklin's.
But it's not a one-to-one relationship there, because again, some leakage could actually go into real investment, creating real jobs. So it's not 100%. Going into non-reproducible doesn't necessarily mean that all that money is out of the economy. Would you agree with that?
I think what you're saying is don't corporations use retained profits to buy investment goods? And to some extent they do. But most investment is done by external financing of some sort, which is borrowing money from the banks or from the public. And the public, in that case, is putting their savings in a financial asset, which they call an equity or corporate bond. Okay. So the savings is still going into a non-reproducible, but then the person who gets the funds can use the funds to buy the services of workers and capitalists and so on and so forth. And the problem is, in an accounting sense, if I save, one or two things can happen. Somebody can dissave and spend on investments, so my savings equal their investment. Or if I save and nobody dissaves, then somebody's income goes down and they save less, so that the total savings in the economy is less than it would be otherwise. And that was the moral of Keynes' theory. So that
Why do you think that Samuelson and the boys reject that? I mean, that's fairly obvious. I mean, you can almost prove that empirically. I mean,
well, it's interesting you ask. On the 100th anniversary of Keynes' birth, there was a celebration at Cambridge University. I went there. A whole bunch of people went there. In fact, I have a picture on the wall I can even show to you of all these economists sitting.
Who were some of them that were there? Can you
Let me.
go ahead?
I don't know if you can see this or not.
Well, we can see the picture. We can't identify the faces, of course.
Okay, there's Paul Samuelson sitting right up in front. Joan Robinson, Nikki Caldor. There's Paul Samuelson. Axel Leonhoff and myself.
Sure.
Joe Stiglitz, a whole bunch of people.
Oh my God, was Passanetti there?
I do not think Luigi was there. No. Jeff Harcourt was there.
Oh my God. Okay.
Ken Arrow. Okay.
Sure.
As you can see, there's about maybe 75.
What a rogues gallery.
Well, anyhow, when Samuelson got up, he started talking about reconstructed Keynesians versus the non-reconstructed, and he talked about Joan Robinson and Sidney Weintraub, who was my mentor, and myself as a non-reconstructed Keynesian, but he was a reconstructed Keynesian because he found that Keynes didn't exactly get the theory right, and he was getting the theory right. And in reconstructing Keynes, he was getting the theory correct. And excuse me. And what was the idea? Well, Samuelson, you got to go back even further. And when he went for his PhD, his PhD was a book he later published called Foundation of Economic Analysis, which won the Wells Prize, which is the best PhD at Harvard, and so on. So here was a young man getting his PhD, and everybody, Harvard was, like the pinnacle of economics at the time. He was identified as some sort of genius. And what was his theory? It was the Walrasian theory, more mathematized and so on and so forth, which he said had to be the foundation of all economic theory. If you didn't have Walrasian theory, you didn't have a good theory. Now, I don't know how much you want to go into the technical, but Walrasian theory says basically it's a barter economy. Things switch for good. There is no money in the Walrasian theory. And not only that, but today, if I wanted to save to buy, why do I want to save? Well, I don't need skis today because it's summer, but I'm going to go skiing in the winter. So I save some of my income today in order to rent skis in January or something like that. But in the Walrasian system, I don't just save it in the form of liquidity. I put in a contract with the ski renter to say on January 15th, I'm going to be there for 2 weeks. You got to have skis of this size and so on and so forth, so that all income is spent immediately on goods and services today, and ordering goods and services for tomorrow, a week from tomorrow, a year from tomorrow, and actually 1,000 years from today is.
That presupposes that you can carry a probability distribution of things happening today forward in time, and I don't believe you fellows, Keynes, yourself, and other people believe that it's ergodic, that these probability processes can be projected in the future. Therefore,
what it implies is I know what I'm going to buy a week from today. I know I'm going to a restaurant 6 months from today, and I know exactly what I'm going to order at that restaurant 6 months today. And I put in the order today so that 6 months from today, they'll have the roast beef that I want, et cetera, and so on. And if I want Jack Daniels, they'll have the Jack Daniels, and so on and so forth. Now, and Samuelson's argument was that's the foundation of all economic theory. And if you do that, then everybody is maximizing their welfare and everything is being produced that is wanted to be produced. And this is the most efficient economy you have. And I pointed out to Paul at this, Paul Samuelson at this Cambridge meeting, well, didn't he ever read this chapter in the back of Keynes's book about essential properties of interest and money, that liquid assets were non-producible and so on and so forth? And he said, oh, there's stuff in the back of the book that really was not very important. So the answer was, as far as I could see, he never read it. And in fact, later on, he's interviewed, and the interview was published by Colander and his colleagues, in which he said that he found the general theory unpalatable. He didn't really understand it. And so he just said, well, it must be a Walrasian theory where the market doesn't work well because prices are not perfectly flexible, and therefore that's what causes unemployment.
Well, you can't.
So the answer was Samuelson didn't know what Keynes wrote. Or
also, you can't mathematize the Keynesian system in a closed form. Once you go into non-reproducibles, and you agree that probability distributions of today can't be legitimately projected into the future, then how can you have a closed system? So he would reject that simply because the math wouldn't work.
Right, that's the point. The orthodox economists in the 19th century, in order to work out their theory, assumed that people knew the future. In modern technology, that's called the ordering axiom. That is, when I make a decision, I know exactly what the results of that decision is going to be a week from today, a month from today, a year from today. If I buy a lathe, I'm a manufacturer, I know exactly what the revenue is going to be generated over the life of this revenue. Whereas Keynes said, when I buy a lathe, if I'm an entrepreneur, why do I buy it? I have animal spirits that tells me I'm going to make profit. I don't know exactly where the money's going to, but so there's a difference between knowing the future and not knowing the future. Well, by the 20th century, we no longer assumed people know the future with absolute certainty, but we said they could do probability theory. So you did probability analysis, and therefore you could insure yourself in essence. And there are certain things that you can insure, such as will my house burn down? And you can buy insurance for that. But you'll notice in the insurance policy, it says your house is insured except in cases of war or other things which are not predictable. So if for some reason your house burns down, not for a normal cause, we can understand that you're not insured. So even in things that are insurable, the insurance company always sticks in a little statement saying, unless something happens that we can't foresee. When you buy a mutual fund, they show you how much they've earned in the past, but they always have a little statement on the bottom saying, past revenues is not any guarantee of future returns. So you don't know, you see. The future is uncertain, or put it in modern probability theory, is what I call non-ergodic. Well, Paul Samuelson said that's nonsense. He just didn't believe in that, the future.
Well, of course, if by not believing in that, and if believing in efficient market theory, this allows you a license to basically do pretty much what you want on the theory that you can't go wrong, that the market somehow will correct you and guide you to the right ends. And of course, 2008 gives us a demonstration that this is absolutely not true. Why hasn't the economic profession taken account of that and really revised their theory based on overwhelming evidence that there isn't such a thing as an efficient market in a true sense, and that you need regulation?
There are people on TV and in the media, in the printed media, who are Wall Street experts. Now, the question is, if they're such Wall Street experts, can they predict what the stock market is going to be, or what a particular price of a particular stock is going to be a week from now and a month from now and so on? Anybody who can forecast correctly has got instant riches. So why is these guys, if they can make so much money predicting, why do they bother selling their predictions to the public? And the answer is because they know their predictions may not work out. And the easiest way is, to be like Barnum. There's a sucker born every minute. There's somebody who's always willing to listen to what I have to say about the market. So we have evidence every day that the future is not predictable, even in the financial markets. Well, if you look at modern financial theory, however, the people who make the theory say, let us assume that people in the market know the future, and then the buyers and sellers operate, and the market knows and corrects. If somebody makes a mistake and does something, everybody sees that's a mistake because the market is going up and you're selling when it's going up, and they correct by buying and so on, so that the market knows where everything is going. Well, the market knows after the fact, but not before the fact. And that's the difference between theory and reality. But the answer is the problem, or let me put it this way, the problem is if you believe in this theory that you can predict the future, then you can sell this to all these fools who are like Barnum, born every minute, and you can make a lot of money on TV and the media, etc. If you're like my Post Keynesian, people get worried. What can you tell me about the future? And my answer is, I can't. Well, what good are you as an economist if you can't tell me about the future? If you were an astronomer, you could tell me when the next solar eclipse will occur. If you were, and so on and so forth. So that's the problem. What I have, and what Keynes had to say, what I and some post-Keynesians say is, look, the future is uncertain, and we know we don't know.
Well, that being the case, then all of the insurance on the derivatives, all of these unstructured securities, all of which were rammed through by deregulation, were ultimately doomed to fail. But in failure, there's great wealth for certain people. So if I'm an investment banker and I have to choose between a Paul Samuelson theory and a Paul Davidson theory, I'm taking Samuelson because I do not want to be regulated, number one. And number two, I make more money in destruction than I make in legitimate business. So you see, the theory is useful. And I'm not saying this in a conspiratorial sense, but as a freewheeler, I'm a Goldman Sachs banker. I know what Paul Davidson says. I get that. I know what you're all about. But I don't want to hear it. Okay, I don't want to hear it because even if I blow up, I make money.
Right.
So I don't want to get into that as any kind of conspiratorial theory. I think smart people just go for the weakness and just exploit it. But to that end, because we don't have a hell of a lot of time, and this I could go on for hours with you, let's take another aspect of theorizing about free trade, of which you have some eloquent work in your recent book about the implications of free trade and the pros and cons. In fact, your book is worth a read in so many ways, but the free trade discussions that you have, it's just nothing short of brilliant. And again, let me just lead you into this. I'm an American corporate executive. I'm in the 70s now. There's a couple of issues going on. Number one, for me to monopolize technology and the GNP growth, doing more than half the GNP growth of the world, I'm leaving a lot of other countries in the wayside, and I know as a good capitalist, this is not going to be good for me in the long run. So I'm willing to share my wealth. I'm willing to give you some manufacturing. Basically, even if I just arbitrage out my labor to just get cheap labor. You made the point that technology can shift instantly anyway, so that the Ricardian issue of free trade doesn't apply, but cheap labor applies tremendously. And of course, this hurts working and middle class people in the long run. And of course, today people would argue that's not true, but it is true. So you would have argued against that kind of transformation. But again, I'm a Wall Street guy. I really don't give a damn about
All right.
pushing out.
Let me give you an example.
Go ahead.
Now, of free trade, and you've pointed out that in mass production, as opposed to natural resources and so on and so forth, the reason why we buy this stuff from China, and China's now having difficulty because Vietnam can undersell them and so on, is because they pay workers very little. They value human labor very much lower in the market than we do. You see, but after all, that means that as a consumer, I can buy something a lot cheaper than if it was made in North Dakota or South Carolina or something like that. And the question I always ask these people about free trade is, suppose we had a foreign factory that used slave labor to produce, to assemble iPhones or something like that. And then they were brought in and we could buy iPhones a lot cheaper because slave labor is very cheap, obviously. Would we as Americans want to encourage the importation of slave labor produced goods?
I know the answer, of course, is no. But then again, price is price for a lot of Americans today. And in effect, a lot of these countries are employing slave labor, quasi-slave labor in many cases. I mean, the working conditions are horrible.
How about child labor? We have laws that says you're not allowed to have children under 14 working in certain kind of factories. They have to be even older than that before they can work and so on. We think that you shouldn't make people work more than 40 hours a week. They have to have free time to go to the bathroom, to eat, and so on. And these other countries don't have these, what I call civilized labor laws. Again, that makes labor cheaper in these other countries. Should we allow child labor goods, if you don't want slave labor, child labor goods being imported into this country? And the answer is, if we believe ourselves to be a civilized people, why haven't we passed this law in the United States that prevent child labor? Why did we have the Civil War? Why don't we just let slaves produce cotton and just think how much cheaper clothes would have been made in New England out of cotton produced by slavery in the South? If we didn't have the Civil War, we could still have slaves in the South. You may remember the Rust Belt versus the South. What was the difference? In the North, which is now the Rust Belt, we had union who insisted on wages, certain labor conditions and so on, which if you moved your factory to the South, you didn't have to meet these conditions because there were no labor unions, okay? So that left the North with a lot of unemployment and created jobs in the South. There was a movie, I forget now what, about textiles, which had a great story about this type of thing. What was the difference was we still had labor laws. You couldn't have children working there. You could pay them less than union wages. Okay. But then the unions went down to the South and tried to organize the workers in the South. And that was a creative problem. Well, the ultimate answer to that was free, cheap, and unions were just raising prices and raising wages, was break up the unions. Now, Calvin Coolidge had started that in 1924 when he broke up the police workers union, and it was not very popular. But Ronald Reagan did the same thing when he broke up the air traffic controllers, and Ronald Reagan gave the signal that it was perfectly civilized, socially acceptable to break up unions.
I got that signal, by the way.
What's that?
I got that Reagan signal.
You got that Reagan signal when you were
right.
Working for, sure. And so you broke up the unions, right? Under Roosevelt or under Truman or even under JFK or even under Eisenhower, you didn't get that kind of signal.
Okay, but also if you do outsource all of that, eventually you have no purchasing power with which to continue the game. You can live off your savings, you can borrow from the people who you've outsourced to, but ultimately you undermine the purchasing power of the main source, which is what we did in America significantly. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay.
And that helps hollow out. We talk about hollowing out the middle class. What made this very prosperous middle class after the Second World War? It was the fact that they were mainly blue collar and low income white collar workers who were suddenly getting high wages and became from lower income into middle income people. Once we started destroying, just to give you a point, when I first got my PhD, my first job as a professor was for $6,150 a year. That was my salary. At that point in time, this was 1958, plumbers made more than assistant professors. Okay, because plumbers were still unionized, assistant professors were not. So you could see why plumbers would be in the middle class. Assistant professors would be struggling to become professors so that they could get to the middle class.
But I would argue as a manager of state that if I'm looking at the long-term interests of, let's say, the American empire, I'm willing to suffer these consequences as long as I can bring other countries, other elites into my system. And even if it's only countries that 10 or 15% of the population have the purchasing power to trade with my 10 or 15%, I'm okay with that. I eliminate communism, the threat of communism. I have circulation and demand with the top 15% of the population around the world. And if I marginalize workers, middle class and workers around the world, I'm really okay with that. I'm not going to say that, but in effect, that's kind of what happens here. And the argument would be, look, if we didn't do this, we'd have wars. We'd have World War I, World War II, those conditions repeating. We'd have autarkic development, souped up development of Germany, Japan, and China. So if we bring them in, co-opt the top group, spread the purchasing power amongst them, keep our elites with purchasing power. So if we marginalize everybody else, you could always say, look, get a better education, it's your fault. But it's not a bad strategy if you can stand the pressure and you can put austerity on the rest of the population. Now, I would argue in doing that, I would have insisted on, instead of marking to the market, like the financiers do, I would have said, okay, makes sense to me that you need to do this for geopolitical reasons. I would mark to the Gini coefficient. You can do it as long as the Gini coefficient looks the same after as it did before. Now, if that were the case, a lot of this wouldn't have happened. Your comments.
The problem in international trade, let's get to this problem, for example. Keynes said, writing in the 1930s, that free trade had become a system where you pushed onto foreigners things that you produced that you couldn't absorb in your own economy. So you forced them to buy it. And you did that at the expense of producing it themselves, which might create unemployment. And so he had this plan, which he brought up at Bretton Woods, about what do you do about free trade to make sure that free trade doesn't just push unemployment onto others. And it was a very simple plan, and I'll give you an example. It really was enforced at one point in time. If I buy a product produced in the United States, I'm creating income for people in the United States. If I buy a product like an iPhone, I'm creating some income for Steve Jobs, but the people who assemble the iPhone and so on are people in China or Vietnam and so on. So I'm creating income overseas, which is good. And people say, well, look how nice China has grown and fewer people in poverty in China. Thank you, America, for doing that. But I'm doing it at the expense of American workers who could assemble the iPhones here and get good income. By the way, I should point out the one thing about the iPhones is they found that the glass in the iPhones, there was nobody in China who could make the glass to the specifications of what Steve Jobs wanted on the iPhones. So the glass from the iPhones is made in Corning, New York. It's shipped all the ways over to China to be assembled in China and then shipped back to the United States. You think about that is a waste of resources. So the point Keynes was making was, if a country is selling things to you, they're earning income. If you're buying things from them, you're giving them the income. If your balance of trade is just equal, the amount of income that you're spending overseas is roughly equal to the amount of income they're spending in your economy, so they're sort of balancing out. But if they're running a persistent trade surplus, export surplus, then they're earning more from you than they're allowing you to earn from them. So his answer was, in that case, there should be some rule which says the trade surplus country has to spend its surplus. And let me give you an example. After the Second World War, Europe was devastated. They needed food, they needed products, but they could not produce it because their production facilities had been devastated by the war. And the United States had produced all this extra food and other things. And who are they going to sell it to? Okay. So what we did is we adopted a form of Keynes's plan, we called it the Marshall Plan. And what was the Marshall Plan? Every year we gave 3% of our gross national product to European countries who said, here's dollars. Buy American goods with it. And so they, since they couldn't buy European goods because they had no productive facilities, so they bought American goods. And therefore we got 9 million men and women out of the military, and they had jobs for them, even though we weren't producing tanks or military. Why? Because they were producing things that the European could use. So the Marshall Plan, which gave away 3% of our 3 to 5% of our GDP for about 5 years, turned out to be very income profitable for us and also for the Europeans. And by the way, one thing that people don't even realize, we even offered the Marshall Plan to the Soviet Union. They didn't accept it. We offered it to them. So there was a good example of like, in essence, we took Milton Friedman would say, we took a helicopter and dropped money on the Europeans so they could buy, drop dollars on the Europeans so they could drop. And that was prosperous for us and prosperous for everybody. So Keynes's proposal in the Bretton Woods was, if there is a country such as China or Japan, who continually runs trade surpluses with the United States, or Germany with Europe, we ought to have some mechanism which forces that country to spend these surpluses on buying things from the deficit countries, which gives the deficit country a chance to work their way out of debt, which is what we want them to do.
Okay, but I would argue, if I'm a Chinese planner, I'm so far behind the GNP per capita curve versus America that I need to do this, and I need to build up capital. I need to accelerate my growth, even if I'm sacrificing my own 2 or 3 generations of workers in China. I need parity with the United States, and therefore I need this asymmetrical trade. This is a question of survival in the Chinese mind. The Japanese got to equilibrium okay, but the Chinese are basically saying, we need to equal the United States in strength because we're afraid of the United States ultimately. So therefore, because more than just the trade and the equalization here, this becomes a strategy of global proportions.
Well, let me say about China. There's a venture capitalist in Manhattan named Henry Liu. He lived up in his 60s. And
I know who he is, yes.
You know who he is?
Yes, I do.
Well,
he's a good friend of Michael Hudson. He's a good friend of Michael Hudson.
And Henry knows people in China. And so Henry and I sent a letter a few years ago to people in China, including the Central Bank of China, saying that what you're doing is you're relying too much on exports for economic growth. What you have to do is increase domestic aggregate demand. You have to somehow create more demand locally for your products and not so much. Now, the Chinese have tried it once or twice. They've not been very successful at it. They have done some infrastructure and so on and so forth, which is what both Hillary and Bernie want us to do to create jobs here, and even Trump talks about it occasionally. Okay, the problem is the Chinese, until Vietnam and Bangladesh and so on came in and undersold China. But now China's running into the problem is they can't keep their workers employed because they're being undersold by this other foreign trade. And that's the problem with foreign trade. If you're relying on foreigners to buy your stuff when you have productive facilities in your country, and you have people in your country that would like to have more of the stuff that you can produce or should be producing.
Well, the Chinese would probably argue, we agree with that, but we're not, our capital, equipment, and technology complement is not quite equal to the United States. So we'd rather plow the demand we might give away to consumers back into capital equipment, hand to mouth, get rid of it overseas, whatever way we can, until we reach a geopolitical comfort level that our capital structure technically is the equivalent of the United States capital structure, rather than leveling off at a lower growth and then have to use the demand to ratchet up at a slower pace.
Well, that assumes that your technical structure's got to be the same if you're producing the same products. If you're producing different products,
And essentially, you're going to produce.
You may not need the same technical structure.
Yeah, but you basically have proven the fact that essentially modern economies are essentially interchangeable, technically speaking. This is not a bananas versus machinery issue here. China is in the same temperate zone as America. I mean, they ultimately 85% of what they're going to produce is manufactured or technology, and they probably feel they must equal us. Well, in that complement of technology.
I was in China about 2 years ago or something, and what amazed me was you walk down Beijing, the streets of Beijing, and 95% of the people were holding wireless phones. I assume they were iPhones. I couldn't tell just because. And everybody was talking on an iPhone in China, and you think of China as this poor country. Now, I didn't go out into the countryside, and it may well be that in the countryside, farmers don't have iPhones yet, but everybody in the city had an iPhone. So, the Chinese were not only producing enough to sell it back to the United States, but they were producing enough, apparently, for their own population. I suspect now that a lot of iPhone production is occurring in Bangladesh rather than that. The question is, if we put there's two questions. One is domestically, your work is fully employed. Is the total aggregate demand of your workers, your capitalists, your landowners, and so on? So, are they getting everything they really need, or want? Not need, but want, so that they're being saturated with demand. Okay, and then the question is, what should we do? And in that case, if we continue to produce, the implication is we're going to produce more than America wants to buy. I don't think that's the case, but it could be. Well, then we have to have leisure. Remember, in the 1930s and 40s, we passed the 40-hour work week. Before that, people worked a lot more than 40 hours, right? In many occupations now, people work less than 40 hours, right?
Oh, you can take up with that. Let's take a look at the old American.
Leisure is a good substitute for work. Okay. If you got enough goods.
But then, if you're not keeping up with China, who doesn't take the leisure, then you might be nervous from a competitive point of view. But let's go back to a closed American system.
Okay.
I mean, the American system in the 1800s, the American system was high wages, but forced draft innovation because of those high wages, and the technology that was forced because of that allowed America to compete around the world. By outsourcing, we kind of kill that internal technical development across the board. We still have it in, let's say, pharmaceuticals, universities, and so forth. But by having free trade, we lose that impetus to drive new technological developments. But if I'm an investment banker, I don't particularly care where technological developments come from. I'm just arbitraging short-term profit opportunities all the time.
Okay.
And so that's a problem. But then this begs the ultimate question, a Keynesian question. Let's assume all countries reach the current state, the optimal state of technology, where they don't really have to trade for each other in any significant way. Does the capitalist system, as currently constituted, always going to be deficient in demand? In other words, are you going to, because of technology, because more and more things can be made by fewer and fewer people, do we have, a realization problem that's endemic to the system? Keynes confronts it in a downturn in the Depression, but kicking the football down the road to the present time and forward, given automation on all of that, fewer and fewer people can make everything that we need, and therefore more and more people are going to become marginalized. Therefore, if you want to keep these people on the planet, you're going to have government spending of one form or another. And do you have any comments on that? In other words, is there enough aggregate demand if an economy is balanced out without the government having to artificially induce it by its investment and so forth?
I think you're tiptoeing around the question that unemployment in the United States is no longer a problem of outsourcing because we don't increase our output, but it's automation. That robots are increasingly taking over from humans, and we're creating jobs via robots. Unless you work for Delta, as you know what happened yesterday with the robot computer system, which I'm sure if it was done by humans, it would have not gotten as serious as it did get. But the question of robots, okay, and here I must say there's a professor at Syracuse University who's a law professor who has, who has the idea that somehow or other what we have to do is get these robots, which are capital investments of firms, basically, to get the workers to own more of the capital equipment, not in a communist sense, but in the sense of getting workers to be able to borrow from banks to put in robots, okay, and use the income that they would generate because they had the property right in the robots then to pay off these loans, so that the more income is going to capital in some sense, but still ending up in workers' pockets, okay, so that the workers don't suffer from automation. Now that's an old theory. I don't know if you know Kelso. Leon
Oh
Kelso.
yes, the two-factor theory, sure.
Yeah, well, he had this idea of ESOPs.
Mutual fund of every workers who end up owning all American industry by investing, sure.
And so it's the question then becomes: is there some way that workers can get property rights in capital if capital is going to take over all human effort in what we call labor? Then how are people going to earn income? There was a movie called Sleepers. I don't know if you ever saw it, by Woody Allen, in which everything was done by robots. You had robots serving your meals, cleaning your clothes in your house, and so on and so forth. Even had robots for sex, so you didn't have to find a sexual partner. The thing that Woody didn't figure out is, how did people buy these robots to work their houses? You see, you need incomes to buy these robots. See? And that's the question. If we automated everything so that humans never had to lift a stick or something like that, how are we going to get all this population?
Well, we Georgians would argue this. We say that today, according to our calculations, the U.S. economy consists of 30% of monopoly profits of one form or another. I mean, if you take land rents, you take monopoly capital corporations, if you fairly follow the trail of monopoly, about 30% of what we kick off in the GNP is a form of monopoly. If we tax that and tax nothing else, and we issue that as a citizen's dividend, in effect, you'd start to correct that problem as it went. And but I didn't want to get into espousing that. That's kind of the things we're looking at and work on here. But we think that we can finesse that problem by really taxing monopoly and therefore give it to the citizens, not what we call give it to a Stalin figure who takes the rent in, Soviet Union, but in effect creates a citizen's dividend for monopoly as a base income, and then let things ride from there. We think the system would self-correct pretty well, especially if the citizens were informed. They saw the money was theirs, they know why they got it. And then the more things were automated, the more monopoly you'd be creating and the more tax you'd be creating back.
But wait a second. Monopoly, what is the source of this monopoly? An awful lot of the source of monopoly is what we call patents.
Patents, yes, but you'd have to look at patents.
Now, we give patents because we think it's desirable to encourage people to do technological research and development and so on. So the government, on one hand, is going to create this profit opportunity, and now you're going to say, well, we're going to use the income tax to take it away from them. Well, if you're going to use the income tax to take it away from them, what good is the patent going to be?
Well, the patent's got a finite life, but you're talking about, ownership of land and resources where you're getting rents which are unearned, And if those things were just taken, and they wouldn't distort the system would still be a free enterprise system, but you would be relieving that constant buildup of monopoly. Everything is tending toward monopoly today, one form or another. Take the Facebook. I mean, it's a first move of monopoly in space, in the internet. Nobody's going to ever challenge that. If they're making monopoly profits, you tax a percentage of that profit and contribute it to the citizens' dividend, let's say.
Keynes said, Winston Churchill once said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all other governments that ever tried. As far as Keynes was concerned, capitalism is the worst form of economic system except for all other systems that have ever tried. And his argument was, well, let's see if we can improve the operation of capitalism. And he said there were two major problems of capitalist system that made it bad. One was the failure to provide persistent full employment, and the second was the arbitrary and inequitable distribution of income and wealth. Okay, for much of the years since the Great Depression, we solved the full employment problem pretty well, and until recently. Okay, the income and wealth problem we haven't solved. Why? Because what's happened is because of monopolies and the ability to outsource production, reduce the wages of the middle class in the United States, and increase the profit opportunities of the entrepreneurs of domestic firms. Okay, so what you're saying is, well, why can't we? It's the old argument that with trade, there's going to be winners and losers. Why can't we get the winners to compensate the losers for their loss, and then everybody will be better off because trade provides more goods cheaply? And the question is, just look at the tax system under if Trump gets elected, and even if Hillary gets elected, and ever since Reagan, the tax system has become less progressive, not more progressive. And you're saying, well, we're going to just make it more progressive. Politically, I don't think that's a possibility, but maybe you're right. So I don't see that as it's an economic solution, but I don't see it as a political solution. The alternative is, as I say, I don't know, in the corporation you had, did you pay your executives partly with stock options? Well, okay, that's the alternative, giving workers stock options so that they get property rights in the capital.
Well, it's the same thing. You're giving away the monopoly back to the general population, and no matter how you cut it.
Well, the question is, you're giving it back, but you're giving it back in a way which is socially acceptable as well as legal. I mean, there are two things you have to worry about: legality and socially acceptable. I mean, if you look at most of the CEOs, they get this millions and millions of dollars in income, but a lot of it is stock options. It's not all paid to them in cash, but nobody objects to that. But it's taxed. If you're a hedge fund person, it's taxed at a different rate than otherwise. But if you're a CEO of a regular corporation, it's taxed as income.
They
Right?
got all the power. That's why it's done. It's a power relationship, and we would argue as Georgists that cutting into monopoly is fair and understandable. You can understand what is monopoly and what is. We would be arguing no tax on incomes at all or profits. Just tax a percentage of the monopoly that's thrown off in the system, and it would equalize and it would relieve the pressure on the system. Nothing's perfect, but it would be a powerful equalizer
Well,
especially for aggregate demand issues.
well, remember now,
Final comment is yours.
profits we can avoid as long as you're a multinational corporation. You can avoid your profits tax by keeping your profits offshore. Okay, and a lot of corporations do that. So although you have a higher rate of profit on the books in the United States than you do in Ireland or many other places, the actual rate of profit that many big corporations pay is much lower than the book rate. Okay, so another point that Keynes made about all of this was you had to have control of capital flows as well. Or I think Hillary has even pointed out that she would want to tax profits that were not repatriated immediately. She would have them taxed anyhow. So you could get to the profits that way. But as long as you have this global view of the economy, there will always be ways people will game the system. And the question is, can you figure out some system where legally they can't game the system? Well, it seems to me one of the legal ways is equivalent of ESOPs, give workers property rights in capital, in which case it doesn't matter because they get that income no matter where it's located. See? Whereas otherwise you have to hope that the IRS is doing their job and taking the income from one group and giving it to the other. And very rare that the winners compensate the losers in international trade.
Professor Wolf, the New York professor, he advocates workers' participation in corporate management and basically control the workplace and vote in effect themselves, an equivalent, what he considers a moral wage or a recompense. He's saying until workers control the workplace itself, that nothing can happen. Your comments on that, and it'll be your final comment.
Well, I mean, the idea of workers sitting on board of directors, I suppose, is what he's thinking of, rather than, or is he thinking of just management?
Management. He's thinking of all the way through management and up to the board of directors, that they would be part and parcel of corporate decision making.
I see. Okay. Well, there's nothing wrong with that, except the stockholders have a right to say who sits on the management and on the board of directors. So how are you going to change the law?
Well, that's another problem now, isn't it? But anyway, Paul,
yes.
Any final comments you want to make? Because it was a great interview. Glad to have you aboard.
Let me say that this book, which you've been talking about, I originally wanted to, or I was told originally that we ought to title it, it's called Post Keynesian Theory and Policy, that a better title would have been Who's Afraid of John Maynard Keynes? Because if you just say the word Keynes, people fear him almost as much as they would fear if I said Karl Marx. The difference is Keynes would try to save capitalism.
Well, let me say this. That book, your book, and I know you've written many of them, and I've read many of your books. This particular work is terrific. I mean, it's compact, it's concise, it's to the point. I don't know what the right title should be, but I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes your most influential work, even though it's not your most heavy-duty work. I get it. It's kind of an abridgment of what you understand and know. But it was so to the point and covered so many of the crucial topics. I read it and I said, this is the book I want to interview you with.
Fine.
It is a great book. So why don't you put it up, because we get hundreds of thousands of viewers now. Show it right now. Okay. That's okay. Good. Perfect. This book is worth its weight in gold in understanding current policy right now. And Paul Davidson is one of the greats in economics over the past 50 years. Not always honored, but more correct, I think, than any other economist that I know. So, to a Brooklyn boy,
Thank you.
that's it for this edition of Smart Talk. For more information on this and past episodes, please go to our website, henrygeorgeschool.org. I'm Andrew Mazzoni. Thank you for watching Smart Talk.